pro et contra.
We should be focusing laser-like on China. We should not be focusing on the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. But it was through our foolish policies in the past that we failed to prevent these two wars from breaking out and got ourselves deeply involved in both of them to the detriment of American foreign policy.
Welcome to this eye-opening interview. I'm Alexis Papazoglou. I'm a senior editor for the online magazine of the Institute of Art and Ideas, and I'm delighted to have as our guest today John Mearsheimer. He is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and is considered to be one of the most influential international relations theorists of his generation. He is the author, among other books, of How States Think, The Rationality of Foreign Policy, and The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. So without further ado, John Mearsheimer, welcome to the Institute of Art and Ideas.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So you are one of the key proponents of what is known as the realist school of international relations, which is this kind of framework that tries to explain the behavior of states as rational actors aiming to maximize things like power and security. Can you tell us just briefly, why is this the best framework for explaining how states behave, in your view?
Well, it's very simple. It's the best explanation because that is how the world works. But also because there is a compelling logic that underpins the realist story. And it goes like this. We live in a world where there is no higher authority that can protect states if they get into trouble. And at the same time, we live in a world where it's very difficult to tell what the intentions of other states are today, and certainly what they will be in the future. So there may be some powerful state out there that has malign intentions towards your state. And if it comes after you, there is no higher authority to protect you. And in a world like that, it makes eminently good sense to be really powerful, because if you're really powerful, it's highly unlikely that another state will attack you. All states, of course, understand this basic logic, and the end result is that all states compete for power among themselves. So you get security competition among the great powers all the time. And of course, sometimes that security competition leads to war.
So speaking of war, you have very famously argued that this realist framework explains essentially why Russia was going to attack Ukraine and why it has attacked Ukraine. And the idea is that it was trying to prevent it from becoming a security risk, given its ambitions and plans to join NATO and NATO's open door policy. A criticism of this position, of this explanation, have pointed out that this realist framework doesn't quite explain why Russia had to invade Ukraine by land rather than simply, say, bomb it by air. And to them, this looks more like an attempt to conquer Ukraine, an attempt to absorb it into Russia, not merely to neutralize it or prevent it from becoming a security threat. So how do you understand that criticism?
Well, there's no question that the conventional wisdom in the West has long been that Putin was an imperialist. He was bent on creating a greater Russia. And that's the reason he invaded in February 2022. My argument is that there's no evidence to support this. And there is an abundance of evidence to make the case that Putin feared Ukraine becoming a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And most importantly, he feared Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And he and the other Russian elites were dedicated to making sure that didn't happen. And they couldn't do it diplomatically. They tried to reach a deal with the United States to get the United States and the West to call off NATO expansion into Ukraine, but they failed. And he felt that he had no alternative but to invade Ukraine. I think using air power, as your question referred to, would have made no sense at all. He was not going to get much leverage from bombing Ukraine, and it made much more sense to launch a limited invasion, which is what he did.
But you still don't think the aim of Russia was to essentially, or is at the moment, to conquer Ukraine, to try and absorb it into Russia's orbit?
No, I think that since the war has started, there's no question that Russia's territorial ambitions have escalated, and they have already annexed 4 oblasts in Ukraine, and I would expect them to annex a few more oblasts. I don't think they're going to try to conquer all of Ukraine. I think Ukraine will remain as a sovereign state, but there's no question that it'll be a dysfunctional state. And that's Putin's goal, to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional state, a dysfunctional rump state, as I like to say, so that it's no threat to Russia.
I mean, another criticism of this approach, and one that tries to point to some evidence that maybe Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine, is this famous essay that Vladimir Putin published in July of 2021 called "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." And some analysts have seen this as a sort of underlying motivation for why Putin invaded Ukraine, and a telling sign that this was indeed intended as a war of conquest, not just a sort of hit and run job, as it were. So why do you think the realist framework sort of underplays dramatic declarations of ideology by political leaders like this when trying to explain their behavior and how they act?
I think that July 12th, 2021 article that Putin wrote says exactly the opposite of what you said it represents. It doesn't make an argument in there that Putin sees Ukraine as part of Russia and that he is bent on conquering Ukraine. In fact, if you read that piece carefully, it makes it clear that Putin recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He recognizes the settlement of December 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart, and that he believes Ukraine's future is up to Ukraine. What he also makes clear in that essay and in all sorts of other places is that Ukraine cannot become part of NATO because that is an existential threat to Russia. And that's the basic story I tell. But I don't know why proponents of the argument that Putin was an imperialist and was bent on conquering Ukraine point to that July 12th, 2021 essay, because it says the exact opposite of what they claim it says.
Okay, that's an interesting disagreement, I guess. But what about the wider point, putting this particular essay aside, that the realist framework is too focused on sort of structural issues and ignores potentially ideological reasons that might be motivating the actions of world leaders, state leaders, and so on. So looking more at a kind of objective picture and less at kind of the ideas that might be behind the actions of people like Putin.
Well, I think there's no question that ideology matters somewhat in the decision-making of almost all leaders. The question is, how much does it matter? And my argument is that in the vast majority of cases, ideology does not matter much at all. That what really matters are balance of power considerations. States are primarily concerned about their survival. And if you're primarily concerned about your survival, then you worry about the balance of power more than anything else. And if you look at Putin's thinking before the war in Ukraine, it's very clear that he was thinking about Ukraine as an existential threat, Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, and he was interested in preventing that from happening. This was not a case of ideology at play. And in fact, Putin doesn't have much of an ideology. This is not the Soviet Union with a communist ideology. And despite the fact that lots of people like to portray Putin as the second coming of Adolf Hitler, this is not a case of fascism or Nazism at play. It's good old-fashioned balance of power politics. And people in the West should have had the good sense to understand that expanding NATO into Ukraine was going to lead to the destruction of Ukraine. And that is exactly what's happening now.
To mention another famous work that you are known for, which is the Israel Lobby and the US Foreign Policy, in which you document this kind of remarkable level of support, both material and diplomatic, by the United States to the state of Israel. something that, of course, we're witnessing again today. And you have argued that this support cannot be fully explained on merely strategic grounds, and it has more to do with the political influence of certain individuals and organizations that acts to shape U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. So is this not a kind of falsification of your own realist thesis, in the sense that this is proof that states don't always behave merely in accordance with their power and security interests, but they can be influenced by ideologies or particular people that capture power?
Yes, there's no question about it. This is a case that violates my basic realist theory of international politics. And indeed, Steve Walt, who is my co-author on that book, is a realist as well, and he has a different realist theory of international politics than I do. But Steve would readily admit that the case violates his theory as well. It's very important to understand that theories are simplifications of reality. The fact is, we live in an enormously complicated world, and to make sense of that world, we need simple theories. But because they're simplifications of a complex reality, those theories are sometimes going to be wrong. And I argue, this is an intuition on my part, that the best theories in international politics get it right about 75% of the time, which means that you're wrong 25% of the time. And I think the case of the Israel lobby, where domestic politics overwhelms strategic considerations, is a case that contradicts my theory.
Interesting that, you don't think that counterexample is a sort of definitive falsification of the theory. Do you make any adjustments based on that paper and then book that you wrote? Do you think that the realist framework should adjust in some ways to make sense of these counterexamples and allow for a greater role of ideologies and ideas and influence by other means that have less to do with security and power to play a role?
No, because then it wouldn't be a realist theory. And furthermore, it wouldn't be a simple explanation of how the world works, which is what a theory is. You're just complexifying the theory. And once you complexify a theory by adding more and more factors into the story, it ceases to be a meaningful theory. I think you just have to accept the fact, which many people find it hard to do, that theories don't always work, that sometimes they're falsified, and this is a case.
So to move on to a little bit about what's happening in the Middle East as well, you're a big proponent of the so-called US pivot to China. And this is a policy that was adopted already by the Obama administration. And you're critical of the United States for sort of getting bogged down in Russia, now getting involved again in the Middle East, rather than focusing on its main adversary, who you see, and I think the United States sees as being China. There are those who argue sort of the opposite, that the outbreak of these two conflicts are in fact the consequence of the US dropping the ball, as it were, in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and that focusing only on China is the thing that have led the world going up in flames as we see it. So what do you make of that? Is it a credible critique of US foreign policy as we're seeing it?
Well, first of all, as I've tried to make clear, I believe the United States is principally responsible for the Ukraine war. I believe the United States was the principal driving force behind NATO expansion, and that's what led to this war. And with regard to the Middle East, I think if the United States had put significant pressure on Israel, which it was trying to do since at least the Carter administration, to achieve a two-state solution, where you had a Palestinian state living next door to a Jewish state, you would not have the conflict between Hamas and Israel today. So I think the United States failed on that front as well. Although there, I think it was mainly because of the Israel lobby. I think that American policymakers, going back to Carter and moving forward, understood the importance of a two-state solution, but they just couldn't get it. And they couldn't get it because of pressure from the lobby. But anyway, the end result of all this is that we're bogged down in Ukraine. We're bogged down now in the Middle East. There's no hope of us getting out of either one of those conflicts anytime soon. And this is preventing us from fully pivoting to Asia to deal with a threat that really matters. There's no question that China is the principal threat to the United States today. It is a peer competitor, and we should be focusing laser-like on China. We should not be focusing on the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. But it was through our foolish policies in the past that we failed to prevent these two wars from breaking out and got ourselves deeply involved in both of them to the detriment of American foreign policy.
So you mentioned the two-state solution there about sort of Israel, Palestine. Why do you think this solution hasn't happened, given that, as you see it and some others see it, it would be the best guarantor of the security of Israel? And so, again, if we follow the realist framework, a rational state should be pursuing it. And instead, Israel has been sabotaging it for, decades. So why do you think this is? How do you end up explaining it through, again, your kind of IR framework?
Well, I think in the case of the two-state solution, there are certainly some Palestinians who were not interested in that outcome for sure. And to begin with, Yasser Arafat was in that category. But he eventually changed his thinking on the matter and became committed to a two-state solution. And Mahmoud Abbas, who is his successor, and now basically runs the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, is committed to a two-state solution. So there are Palestinians, and there have been for a long time, Palestinian leaders who are committed to the two-state solution. It's been very difficult to get the Israelis to agree to a two-state solution. I think there was only one time where that happened, and that was with Ehud Barak, and that surrounded the very famous Camp David meeting in 2000. But I think even there, in that one case, the Israelis were not willing to go all the way and give the Palestinians a meaningful state of their own. And since 2000, there has been little interest in a two-state solution in Israel, and the government now has a great interest, if anything, in trying to prevent a two-state solution. So even if the United States pushes hard, it's going to run into a tremendous amount of resistance. But the United States can't push hard because of the lobby.
So do you see this resistance on the part of Israel as rational? Like, would it be perhaps more of a security threat if it did have another state on its borders, potentially hostile with more infrastructure and so on, potentially a military, than the situation we have now? Or and if that isn't the case, what's preventing it at the moment from seeing that as a possible solution? Is it ideology again getting in the way?
Well, I think, in the past, you could make the case it was largely ideology, that Israelis wanted a greater Israel. They wanted an Israel that included the West Bank and Gaza. I think now the real problem is the security problem that you described. It's hard to imagine, given the war that's taking place and given what happened on October 7th, that the Israelis would be willing to countenance creating a Palestinian state on their border. Israel, after all, is a very small country, and putting a Palestinian state right on its border when that Palestinian state might have aggressive intentions is really not in the card. So I think we have a situation here where the possibility of a two-state solution, which I think was very real in the past, is no longer a realistic outcome.
I just wanted to ask you about what I see sometimes as a tension in your approach. So sometimes you use the realist framework to sort of describe what is going on the ground, why states are behaving in certain ways. And then other times, like when you criticize the United States for, not directing its full attention to China and instead having its involvement with Russia and now in the Middle East, you seem to use the realist framework not as a tool to explain what's going on, but as a tool as a guide for saying what should be happening. So as a normative tool to say the US should be doing this, should be doing that, it should be pursuing its security interests in this way. So how do you negotiate this kind of tension? Is the realist framework good for describing things, or is it good for prescribing how states should behave?
That's a great question. The answer is it's good for both. As I said before, no theory gets it right all of the time. And that means that states sometimes do not act according to basic realist logic, or at least according to John's realist logic. And I, of course, think that's a mistake, that it would make good sense for states to always operate according to realist logic. But the fact that they don't always do that, you remember I said before, I thought that, and this is an intuition on my part, that roughly 25% of the time states don't act according to realist logic. I think, therefore, it makes sense to argue that states should do this or should do that if they're not acting according to realist logic. So it is both an explanatory theory and a normative theory.
Someone might say that that's a bit like cheating, though, because on the one hand, if as a social scientist you're trying to describe reality, and then you have a theory, you put it forward, and sometimes it doesn't behave, reality doesn't behave like you predict, then you just turn around and say, well, that's reality's fault. Reality should be behaving according to my theory. What do you say to that?
No, I think that's just the way the world works. I mean, that's the way social science works. You're saying that somebody should come up with a theory that explains every case. You're saying, in effect, that a theory should be a perfect explanation of how the world works. There's no social science theory, whether you're talking about economics or political science or sociology, that's going to fit that description. Remember, the world is an incredibly complicated place, and theories are simplifications of reality. You leave out certain factors when you craft a theory, and sometimes those factors that you leave out really matter, and your theory in those cases is falsified. But that's just the way social science works. There's no way that anyone can come up with a theory that explains every case. Before, you were talking about adding more factors like domestic politics and ideology and so forth and so on to my theory. But as I said then, as I'll say again, you no longer have a theory once you do that, because theories are simple descriptions of reality. And when they become complicated explanations, they don't become explanations, they're just descriptions.
Well, John Mearsheimer, thank you very much.
Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.